Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 155 of The Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. This week, I am so very excited to be sharing my recent conversation with Nina Hansen. Nina is the author of the book, The Norwegian Prison System, Halden Prison and Beyond. Her book presents a comprehensive overview of the Norwegian Correctional Service and the values and principles underlying its operation, using the renowned Halden Prison as a case study. Now, since its opening in 2010, Halden Prison has been recognized for its uniquely humane treatment of inmates and its emphasis on rehabilitation. Her book chronicles the lessons learned from the operation of Halden Prison and scrutinizes the effectiveness of its policies. Nina highlights the fact that staff at Halden operate under the concept of dynamic security. You've heard about dynamic security in the past on this podcast. As a reminder, dynamic security is this notion of the staff in prisons circulating around the prisons and interacting and developing relationships with inmates rather than simply surveilling them and having an emphasis on security. More to the point, static security, which is essentially the modus operandi of prisons operating in the United States, in Europe, really around the world. Nina is also a public speaker, a future-ready innovator, and motivator. We cover her book and so much more in our conversation today. And please stay tuned after our interview for some updates as to an opportunity to take advantage of the work that Nicole Staley and I have been doing as to our TIDES project. TIDES stands for Trauma Informed DESistance. And if you are intrigued by the prospect of merging the current approaches around trauma-informed care and desistance from crime, you are going to want to keep on listening. But first, joining the Criminologist podcast all the way from Oslo, Norway, please enjoy my conversation with Nina Hansen, and I will see you all on the other side. Welcome to the show, Nina. Why don't we begin with you simply introducing yourself to our listeners? Just tell everybody a little bit about the journey that you've been on, maybe hitting on some of your educational and professional milestones, and then we'll roll up our sleeves and do a deep dive into your specialty, which is talking all about the Norwegian prison system.
Thank you, Joe, and good morning, everyone. It's very nice to be included in this brilliant podcast about criminology, and it's a great honor for me to be on this show. And as a regular ice bather in Oslo, you can call me, a Norwegian Viking with the heart for writing and communication. And
I love it.
Yes, and I've always been curious about how people live their lives and what makes them happy. So I've been very much involved with positive psychology since 2010. I've written books about positive psychology, flow, breathing techniques, running and health, but also other books like this one coming up now with Are Høydahl, a well-known governor of Halden Prison. And we've done this book about the Norwegian prison service, about the Norwegian correctional service for more than 40 years. So, and I believe, Ernest Hemingway, a colleague of mine once said, as a writer, you should not judge, but you should understand, and you should try to understand and then communicate. So, my appetite of asking questions, meeting people from all walks of life, seeking to learn new things and reading books and papers to try to understand what is going on. And that has gotten me to a lot of academic qualifications, also among them a social science degree and later a master in journalism from City University in London, and a bunch of PhD courses in psychology, academic writing, and also exams in technology, among them artificial intelligence, blockchain, and sustainability. And, Joseph, I believe that this rapid change we are going through in the world of work, we have to be doing and learning new challenges every day. And according to my kids, I have 3 of them, I'm a dinosaur. And they can, they can hardly understand how life was without internet, smartphone, and social media. And as a writer, I've gone through a digital transformation myself. So when this ChatGPT was launched before December, I was really shocked, and they're taking my job. So I had to scale up my knowledge. So now I went to the Consumer Electric Show in Las Vegas, and I tried to learn everything about artificial intelligence. And also I'm a bit concerned about, the gap between the people who actually knows and the people behind. And just imagine, Joe, all this Gutenberg moment in technology, that prisoners who have been locked up have been missing out after years of jail and prisons. So, and last years I've been visiting a lot of prison, and I'm thinking, how should they cope when they get out?
I love your enthusiasm and really your curiosity. I think we are kindred spirits in that regard. I'm always looking to seek out new systems and new paradigms, and I sense you have that same type of curiosity. And I couldn't agree more with your assessment of where we're at as far as you mentioned this sort of Gutenberg moment. I was actually having a conversation with some colleagues in corrections, but we were talking about the role that technology is beginning to play in corrections. And again, to your point, we all somewhat agreed that one of the manifestations of the COVID pandemic was it forced us as a field to leverage technology more. But now that we've come out of the pandemic, as you noted, we're sort of reflecting on, well, why don't we just continue to do this? For example, tablets in the prisons, or a reliance more on e-learning and those types of things. So yeah, I think we are going through somewhat of a seismic shift here with electronics and or AI and the way we communicate and all of the above. So kudos to you for staying on the cutting edge of this.
Thank you.
You mentioned your book, Norwegian Prison Systems, Halden Prison and Beyond. Why don't we start with that? Because we could frame much of this conversation around that. Talk about the inspiration for the book, or even maybe just give us an overview of the Norwegian correctional services. A lot of people are really looking more and more towards that model, that Norwegian model. Give an overview of that, and then we can talk more about some of the specifics around dynamic security and whatnot.
Yes, people are looking more and more, and even Michael Moore actually went to Norway, and he met Are Heidal, who is my co-author on this book, and our intention with the book is to give our readers a view of the whole, Norwegian correctional service and the policy, where underlying values and principles, as well as the practical implications of these policies are highlighted. And we want to include both the historical contexts and also the individual narrative accounts of incarceration in the text, And our question is, can actually punishment change people? And what do we do to help people change? And who do we want to be our neighbors when they come out? And is part of the Norwegian Correctional Service really worth exporting to US? These are the big questions we were asking when we started up this book. And now it came out on Routledge, so it's a great honor to give out this book on the correctional service.
I will leave a link for your book in the description of this podcast episode, so listeners can just go to their device or their computer and they'll get that link if they want to secure your book, which I recommend that they do. I've had some experiences developing programs around the Norwegian model, specifically dynamic security. That is a term that, at least here in the United States, I don't believe many folks in corrections are familiar with. Could you perhaps just give an overview of the difference between dynamic security and static security, which I contend is what we embrace here, at least in the United States?
Yes, and it's strange, like comparing United Nations and the United States, and Norway, because we are such a small country, and the biggest difference is that we have more employees. In Norway, it's about 20 inmates to 2-3 employees, and I believe in other countries there are 100 inmates and 2-3 inmates, and maybe less. And before I start talking about the dynamic security, I think it's important to say that this situation in Norway hasn't been like this, like it is now, because 40 years ago we didn't have the good system that we're going to talk about, and the dynamic security, the import model. I will talk a little bit about it later, and the principle of normality, where inmates should live as normal as as possible behind the bars. But in 30 years ago, in the 80s and the 90s, we had a high re-offending rate, and that was about 60, 70, and that's almost like in the US. Now it's a lot lower in Norway, but we had a lot of drugs in the prison, AIDS, we had like a lot of riots, even two staff were killed. So, in that time, we actually had a bad time in our prison system also. But, we started slowly to change the system of culture and also change the role of a prison officer. And so now, the core of the system today is respect and doing things together and seeing inmates as people. So in practice, the principle of normality, I think that is the most important. Because that means, that the punishment is the restriction of liberty, and no other right has been removed by the sentence in court. Therefore, it's they have the same right as all other people in Norway, and no one should actually serve their sentence under stricter circumstances than necessary for the security in the community. And during their sentence, they will resemble the life outside as much as possible. So I think the principle of normality is one of the main principles that we want to export. And of course, I also mention, the import model, because prisoners have the same right and services, and what we do is we import, these services from the local community. So they are actually working in the prison, but they are not employed by the prison. And of course, now the question you asked was about the static security and organizational security, and of course dynamic security. And I believe this is the way we think. It's quite different from US, because in US I noticed there are a lot of focus on a physical measure like high walls, cameras, alarm system, bars and control measures. And I believe that in Norway we have a different approach, and dynamic security is probably most interesting for the listeners, and I know you're passionate about it as well, because that's more about the interpersonal relationship and systematic form for interaction between the prisoners and convicts and employees. And examples, they can play chess together, they can make food together, they can go on a walk, they can do exercise together. So this is, the core of the approach, in the Norwegian system, among other things that we do different.
you mentioned the principle of normality, which I absolutely love. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about, you mentioned changing the culture and the role of the correctional officer. In my opinion, when I have played a hand in implementing core correctional practices or other change measures, the struggle is in the implementation. I was reflecting on this just the other day, thinking to myself, even under our current risk-need responsivity framework that we operate under, I think that the public would be shocked if they realized, we, in a sense, we have an answer to the crime problem, but the issue is in the implementation. It's not in the science. It's in the carrying out of the science. My question is, how did you, or not you per se necessarily, but in Norway, how was that obstacle overcome of, as noted, the culture and getting the staff to understand that their role is not that of security and compliance, but more of having a relationship and playing, I call it playing the long game, realizing that everyone's going to get out, and it's short-sighted to not embrace that principle of normality. So I guess, again, like I said, my question is, what were maybe some things you observed or some advice you would give to folks like myself and others who may be trying to implement dynamic security, but dealing with that organizational culture?
Yeah, because, in our book, we are talking about 40 years of development, and this is not done overnight, And we had, some Minister of Justice, at least 3 of them, who made good white bills on this, trying to change. The first one, it was a woman, Inger Louise Valle, in the 70s. I mean, they were laughing at her, and they didn't believe what she said, because they wanted people in prison to be, guarding and security, and I mean, she was saying, we want to have, people who cares, and they laughed at her. But then you had 2 more bills, number 27 and 37, and of course, I recommend everyone in the world to read them and translate them, because these are really good groundwork, having a politician who wants this shift. And you never become popular as a politician to go and say, we're going to, have a shift. We want to be soft on crime and not tough on crime. And so, they were really brave people, And of course, in the beginning, prison officers, they didn't want to be like caretakers or health workers. They wanted to be, a kind of tough, masculine culture. But on the other hand, you saw that this actually worked, and the life was better both for the employees and the people inside. So I'm thinking, in Halden, Halden is known as maybe the world's most human, highest security jails in the world. And the prison, it has a gym, it has a library. Every prison has a library, of course, and a kitchen, and you can study, you can work. And what is unique is that actually they do this together, the inmates and the people. They eat together, they play soccer together, they exercise. And my co-author, Are Høydahl, who was the governor in Halden prison for 12 years and before that 10 years in Oslo prison, he's convinced that the secret and the success lies in that relation, building dynamic security. And the dynamic security, it's useful because they don't only look at the security situation, but it's useful in the effort to inspire and to motivate to change, because you can't ask people to change. The people have to want to change themselves, and then you can help them. So I don't know if that was a long answer, but I think, the clue with the dynamic security is that you actually have time and you have enough staff. And that is probably one place you can start with in US, to get more staff and also use time to focus on relations and not on the alarms or the walls and the static security.
I want to touch on another aspect of your book. You talked about the practical implications of the Norwegian prison experience, which you've been highlighting now. And you talk about what has been working well over these last 40 years and what could be improved. Could you maybe touch on each of those?
Yes, I mean, not everything is perfect in Norway either. I mean, we have we have had critique about our isolation problems. We have too many people isolated, especially like maybe people with mental challenges. And also, I believe it's a shame how we treat female prisoners in Norway, because they are in, all the prisons and they don't have the same service and the same offers that the men. So, I mean, there are a lot of challenges in the Norwegian prison service. So we have had a couple of chapters where we look at what have we been criticized for and what can we do with this, because it's a challenge with mentally ill people all over the world. So it's not only in Norway. So we haven't solved that problem, a challenge either.
I'm a big believer that there's a lot of value in gaining the perspective of others when we're involved in a change process. And again, in your book, I know that you looked and got the perspective of various populations working within the prison system, ranging from the policymakers to prison officers and even inmates. Could you maybe reflect on the perspective of each of those populations from their lens of how this Norwegian approach has been going?
Yes, I think it's important in such a book to have all these different aspects. And it was important for us to choose, inmates who actually can articulate their situation. So we have 4 inmates in the book. Arne Treholt, he just died now. He was, accused for being a spy. And Trond Henriksen, he's one of the inmates in a book that we follow. He had problems with drugs and he was maybe one of the most dangerous prisoners. So we actually follow in the book. We try to follow into the prison, during the prison, and when he come out. And also we have, of course, ladies in Bredtvet prison, where we actually had a suicide last week in Norway. So it was a big catastrophe. But a lot of us maybe saw that it could come, because it was a lot of suicidal situation in the women's prison in Norway. And also I spoke to inmate in Chester prison in US, because they have a project called Little Scandinavia, and he was in for life sentence. And it was so interesting, because he compared his past in the American prison and now in Little Scandinavia. So I think these stories has to be told in such a book, because a lot of these books, they are written by scientists or researchers, criminologists, for other criminologists. So I wanted to write a book that everyone can read and everybody can get inspired from.
I love that approach you take about, we write for other criminologists or other academics or other policymakers, but we don't really get that holistic approach. A dear friend of mine and mentor, Dr. Guy Bergone, who's up in Canada and was part of the Sticks project along with Dr. Banta, one of the best words of advice he ever gave me was, Joe, we've got to take the gobbledygook out of what we do. I mean,
gobbledygook.
Gobbledygook is a term like, the nonsense,
yeah.
Well, and his point was, we tend to write to other peers, but as far as implementation goes, we need to connect the dots between the researchers, the academics, the policymakers, even I would argue the trainers, and then down to the line staff, and then out to the public and the layperson. Because I think our biggest hurdle sometimes is it's a public relations hurdle. As you said earlier, no politician is going to run on the campaign promise of I'm going to be more humane on crime or introduce empathy into what we do. What would you say? Because I hear this all the time when I talk about dynamic security and the Norwegian approach of people will say, well, Joe, we don't want to run prisons like hotels. I'm sure you've heard this.
Yes, of course. And, I did this exercise taking Nelson Mandela's the former prison officer, to Norway. I actually invited him and I brought him to Halden prison. And the first thing he said, this is not a prison. Do they have their own bath? Do they have toilets? And it's still a prison. And he was like kind of shocked. And I've heard, also British conservative politician coming to Norway, and they actually it's an eye opening that you can actually run a prison like this. And for us, we wrote a book like a funnel, going from the outside perspective, bringing Nelson Mandela prison officer in, and then you have this Trond inmate going in, and then the funnel going out when he leaves the prison again. And that is maybe one of the most important chapter, mind the gap. Because, for some people, that is the most challenging, the gap between the prison and back to society. So this is how we actually wrote the book. We were thinking we were going to implement everybody. It's like in a funnel and then out again.
I love it. Talk more about, where did you get the inspiration to bring in Nelson Mandela's former prison officer as sort of I don't want to call it a beta test, but, to get that perspective, that's brilliant.
Yes, I've always been a great fan of course, Nelson Mandela and what he stood for. And I met him personally when he visited Norway. And of course, I've been to South Africa and the Robben Island. And that's where I actually met Christo Brand, who's the prison officer. And I talked to him a lot about, that kind of history. And Nelson Mandela, he had so much good reflection on, how should we look upon society, and we should look upon the people who's lowest in the table is what we say, and the way we treat people in prison also tell us a little bit about the humanity in the society. So that was the reason why I brought him, because I brought in also Nelson Mandela's views and his attitude towards other people, because it's all about actually a very simple thing. You have to respect people, even if they are inmates or they are outside the prison. It's all about showing respect. That doesn't cost a lot. It doesn't cost anything, actually. So you can start with that, because what I've seen in the US is not very. It's not very.
Nina, I'm curious, are you aware of any attempts to expand the principles of dynamic security beyond the prison walls into the community, into the probation and parole sector, for example?
Yes, I think, the dynamic security in Norway, it's not only in the correctional system, but also within, the security staff in the airports, and also, of course, in probation. And I think this spirit of dynamic security, it's a very good system that you can use, and it's more human way of approaching security. And in that, the biggest challenge is maybe having in mind the balance between, being a personal and professional, and then being, also private. So I think the perspective of thinking that all the inmates one day they should be released. And maybe they be your neighbor. And I think, this is the aspect you have to think of all the time. And I believe you can use that in all kinds of levels,
I love that approach. I know that I've had some engaging conversations with my colleagues over here about the evolving role, as you noted, of the corrections officer, the probation officer. We have an expression here in the United States in the field of probation and parole where we'll use the term that we wear two hats. In other words, sometimes we have a responsibility to the court and to public safety, and then we're also a change agent and that therapy agent. But my contention is over the years, we've leaned way too heavily more into the hat that we wear when we're resembling more of a police officer than a social worker. And we really need to re-examine the role of the probation officer. I mean, I know we talk about identity transformation in desistance, and I think as a vocation in corrections, we need to go through that same identity transformation, because that's the key to making all this work, is how the staff member views their role. And again, right now, sadly, I think it's more of an emphasis on control and security, and the rehabilitative efforts are an afterthought. They take a back seat to that primary role. So I think the key is flipping that around. Almost, when Chris Trotter talks about role clarification, I think we need to do some soul searching and clarify our roles in our hiring, in our promotion, and really start to change that culture.
I agree with you totally. And I think the rigid system, where you focus too much about the static security more than the relations, then you actually don't prove, so you don't, I think it's very important. I mean, we could start with including, respect to everyone.
Mm-hmm. I train on a variety of so-called core correctional skills, core correctional practices. But I know that at the foundation of all of these things, whether it's a cognitive behavioral intervention, whatever the intervention might be, the foundation of that is the relationship. And without that solid relationship, all these other fancy evidence-based practices are really muted. They really don't take effect. And I don't think people really realize the extent of that.
Agree totally. We agree on everything, I think. Also the aim of this podcast. I really like this podcast.
Thank you so much. Yes, we are kindred spirits. I love your infinite mindset, as I like to call it. Say, let's celebrate you a little bit more. On April 25th of this year, you will be traveling to Scotland to speak to their legislature. Talk all about that, if you wouldn't, please.
Yeah, I was called up by some politicians from the Labour Party in Scotland. They are not in majority, but they were very curious because Scotland, has the highest prisoners compared to the population in Europe, actually. I didn't know that before. So they called me and say, can you come up and speak a little bit about the book? And I've invited, people that I know have the same attitude as you. Like we have a common friend, Sarah, she's coming. I also bring, of course, always musicians who will play Johnny Cash, and maybe some from The Agent is the New Black. So, I bring some musicians from Norway, and we bring the book, and we're going to talk with the politicians and maybe the press there, just to inspire, motivate.
I will watch for that. You and I are connected on LinkedIn, so I will watch for those updates and promote those and talk about those as well. And yes, for the record, you are talking about our dear friend, Dr. Sarah Lewis of Penal Reform Solutions, who has done amazing work in her own right. I've worked with her as well, creating and crafting some correctional leadership programs around dynamic security. So that's great that you made that connection as well. I know beyond all the great work we've been talking about in your book, you also keep busy doing other things, such as a motivational speaker. What is that experience like? Just not generically, but just overall that experience as a motivational speaker.
Well, it's marvelous. It's very exciting. I've published 8 books, and a lot of them about motivation and positive psychology. And also, I believe, it's since I've been writing, for the last 30 years, I have traveled vastly to inspire people from, these books. And also, I'm concerned with, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, because I think this is also also something that at least inspire me and motivate me to make this world change. And I think, the best part of being a speaker is that you can talk to people like you in this podcast, you can meet new people, you can learn a lot. And I think, the best thing is to get into the flow zone like I'm doing and try to help people fulfill their dreams, behind the bars and also outside the bar, how to breathe better, for anti-stress. And I think it's really good fun traveling around, inspiring people.
I'm going to steal that expression from you, the flow zone. I love that.
Yeah.
And yes, we are kindred spirits, as you noted. One of the fringe benefits of this podcast is simply me having these one-on-one conversations with other thought leaders such as yourself. I often tell people, ironically, if no one listened to the podcast, I'm just growing my own human capital by talking to people like you and growing my social capital by linking up with people and even just having these one-on-one conversations. And then the benefit of the listeners is just the icing on the cake, if you will. I know we are going to keep in touch. I know we've already made a great connection here. The next time I've got you back on the show in a year or two, Nina, look into your crystal ball, look into the future. What do you envision we might be chatting about in the future?
Oh, the crystal balls. I don't normally look in that, but my dream is that, this podcast and also the book would inspire to slowly to make a movement to change the system with more focus on rehabilitation in some maybe of the states. And I hope that next conversation we'll talk about the success stories where inmates are having a good process. They want to change and have the opportunity and become a lawful and good citizen and taxpayers and be your good neighbors. That's what I'm hoping for. That's my dream.
Have the high dream, as we like to say. Exactly. Aim high. Nina Hansen, the name of your book is Norwegian Prison System, Halden Prison and Beyond. I can't thank you enough for being on the show. I will leave the link to your book in the episode description of this podcast, and I encourage all my listeners to check that out. Until we speak next time, Nina, so lovely having you on the show.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
A big Criminologist podcast thank you to Nina Hansen, joining us all the way from Oslo, Norway. As promised, I have left relevant links in the episode description of this program, including the link to her book, The Norwegian Prison System, Halden Prison and Beyond. Nina also forwarded a slew of related articles talking about the role of technology moving forward in regards to smart prisons, artificial intelligence. I'm going to leave links for as many of those articles as I can squeeze in here. I see she's also got some articles from our friend Pia Puolaka, who appeared on the show talking about smart prisons. So please make sure to check those out. Finally, as promised, I want to tell you all about an initiative that Nicole Staley and I have been working on. Nicole is, of course, a friend of the podcast. She has made several appearances in the past, talking primarily all things trauma. She is indeed an expert on trauma-informed care, and what she and I have done is to create a program model which merges the themes of trauma-informed care with those of desistance from crime, all intended to work in harmony with an agency's current foundation of risk, need, responsivity. We are officially unveiling our Tides program and are inviting any and all interested parties to reach out to us for more information. Our Tides program model is a holistic approach in supporting marginalized individuals on their pathways to change. Tides, our trauma-informed desistance program model, is a custom-designed, strength-based approach that incorporates trauma-informed, evidence-based and desistance principles to support justice-involved individuals in leaving a life defined by criminality. To be clear, this is not an off-the-shelf, one-size-fits-all practice model. Rather, TIDES is custom designed to augment an organization's current evidence-based interventions aimed at providing sustainable, lasting change for justice-involved individuals in a variety of settings. Drawing from the research around trauma and desistance, our aims include instilling a sense of safety. Now, this may begin with simply changing the culture to be more aware of trauma backgrounds. It may include psychoeducation for clients and professionals on the topic of neuroplasticity. And of course, when we talk about experience a sense of safety, it's all about that all-important working alliance. And yes, you heard me right, neuroplasticity. This approach really leans into the emerging research and literature around neurocriminology, which we feel really sets us apart. Another aim of this approach involves restructuring cognitive barriers. For example, recognizing the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that interfere with desistance. Examining the role of identity in desisting from a life of crime and developing new perspectives on identity that lead to shifts in beliefs and behaviors. And of course, we have the aim of reintegration. Now, this may involve community members bearing witness to client change, creating opportunities for community engagement, and building on client successes. In short, TIDES utilizes trauma-informed practice while incorporating current knowledge and research on pathways into crime, risk, need, responsivity, in addition to those pathways out of crime, desistance. If you are even slightly intrigued by the prospect of adopting this approach, please reach out for details. You may contact me through this podcast. Our email is thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. You can connect with me or Nicole Staley through LinkedIn, or you could contact Nicole directly through her email of NicoleReneeConsulting@gmail.com. NICOLE, Nicole, Renee, RANAE, consulting@gmail.com. And of course, you may connect with us through our website, theparagongroup.llc.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. We are also on Twitter, the Criminologist Media Group. Give us a follow at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. As noted, you may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, or Nicole Renee Staley on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. And if you believe in what we're doing on the program, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us, ask them to subscribe to the podcast, and of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
Agree totally. We agree on everything, I think. Also the aim of this podcast. I really like this podcast.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.